what do I think contributes to the authoritarian? Well, I mean, 5,000 years of patriarchy, I guess, was like the simple answer, but it's a little too simplistic in a way. It's both deep and simplistic simultaneously. But, I mean, we do have rape has been going on for a long time because we have a culture where women's sexuality and girls' sexuality is treated as something that needs to be controlled and as something that can be diminished and taken away from them and not fully owned by the human being herself. And it's always been a way to control women. And I guess, I mean, I feel like I'm going into like a deeply philosophical place here, but I guess I would say the threatening power, we're having a light show, the threatening power there is, women have the ability to give life and they have the power to not give life, and that's actually a really profound power. It's a big thing for women to manage, and it's a big thing for the way that our culture has evolved to manage. So when you have a patriarchal culture, they're always having to then control that person who actually has all this power too and keep her diminished. And I think rape is a way of keeping people diminished. But rape really diminishes men too, and none of us have grown up in a healthy environment around sex and sexuality and violence. And I think all of the interest right now in meaningfully addressing campus rape, even coming from the president, that's never happened before. We're on that level. There's leadership around rape. What I'm hoping will come out of that is we can all connect a little more deeply and meaningfully to our own experiences and to the lessons that we learned, to what we've observed in our parents, the role modeling that shaped us, and try to find a way to have the consciousness to be different, to not enact those more brutal ways of treating one another. And I think, one way that I think about this a lot, I do think that learning how to have sex and experimenting with one's sexuality, now there's a lot of light on me, it's an important time. It's a really awkward time. And the way that our culture sort of treats that is almost like you're not allowed to fumble. You need to know, and I think this has just been, the heat has even been turned up for your generation, roughly speaking. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be super into it. You have to be really sexual and know everything right away. And that's just obviously impossible. And so that conflict of having to pretend to know how to do things you don't know how to do as you're learning what you're even interested in, or even learning how your body works, I think allows for a lot of bad things to happen. And I think, and I speak as someone who, I was probably like in my mid-30s before I ever had sex without alcohol involved. So it's not like I think I did so well, but I think the way that we use intoxicants to deal with the awkwardness or the embarrassment or the shame that comes with the way our culture treats sex is another risk factor in our rape culture. So that kind of went off in lots of different directions for what you were saying, but I think, I think that rape culture, I think that rape is simultaneously simple and horrible and like just so obvious that it's bad and deeply complex. And I hope you felt that way with the women's stories. Like, I love Wagatwe's story because she dated her assailant for a long time, and I really love the way that the full complexity, I think it's a very relatable story of what contributed to her inability to act in the moment. I love the way that she describes that, and none of the women, I think, I really felt like I tried to provide space that they didn't have to be perfect victims, that and you still see them really grappling with how complicit they felt and their shame or their guilt about that. Not because I'm not interested, I'm deeply interested, but I think it would be a very different film if you met all of the people that were these people's perpetrators. You would have some compassion for them too, I bet. I haven't gone down that road, but just knowing, I know my sister's assailant, I know that, I know some things, and so I have a feeling if I really gave these gentlemen their due and acted the way I did with these women, where I just wanted to hear what they were thinking, I think that we would hear a complex story. I don't think we would be like, oh, I can totally see why you did that, but I think we would also connect with them as human beings. That's kind of what this medium does. The reason I didn't include male victims was more inadvertent. I had several men have come up to me and talked to me about, I've never done an event, and in the years before this film was done, when I would just be speaking on college campuses, which is something I do a lot, I've never mentioned that I was working on this project where many, like 6, 10 people didn't come up to me afterwards and talk about what has happened to them in terms of incest and rape. So I know it's very common. And oftentimes it was a man. And there was one guy in particular whose story I thought was really important, and I really, really wanted to tell. And we went pretty far down the path of getting to the interview. And then he just sort of discussed it with his family and with his therapist, and he felt like he didn't want to do it. And the reason he didn't is he's a male survivor of rape by a woman, and he felt afraid. All these women felt afraid that people are going to be like, you weren't really raped. He really felt that way. He was like, I'm just opening myself up to something that I'm not really prepared to deal with, being the poster child for this story, even though he knows from experience too and from conversation with other men, he isn't the only person in that situation. And so, you know, I have a desire to tell that story, certainly. And I have a desire to tell the story of perpetrators too, but it's just not where this film went. Okay, well, I think that's such a good question from your student body president, right? So I think, well, I am a journalist, but I'm kind of now in my current job not doing a lot of that. But the cool thing about being a journalist is you're just sort of paid to be curious and have curiosity and even be nosy. So just, you know, you're constantly interviewing people and asking questions and asking their opinion, but also asking their biography and what has actually happened to them. And, you know, just nodding a lot and getting them doing what you're doing to me and getting them to say more. And I think that sort of led me down a path of being able to do, I made another documentary about abortion, being able to ask people about these things that we say we believe in, that we have strong opinions about, but they're actually very divisive within our society. So with rape, it's not so much divisive, is it bad, but we haven't been able to move the needle forward at all on in terms of eradicating it in any way. And then abortion, people tend to say that they believe in abortion rights, but the reality is that most Americans also believe in a lot of restrictions too, so there's tremendous ambivalence. So, you know, by asking questions about people's own lives and their own histories, I felt like I could get closer to what the real truth was, not just our stated beliefs, but like how we practice what we really believe. And so I would say the way that I think is the best way to connect to any issue is to connect personally to it. So I'm trying to think with Ferguson, I mean, there's so many things. Last night I remember before they made the announcement, I was like, we all know there's not going to be an indictment, because I was just thinking every situation like this in my lifetime at age 44, there's never an indictment. So just sort of the setup and the falsity of the hours of like, whatever happens, I hope we can keep it peaceful, was very upsetting to me. But it helped remind me of what it felt like to be 20 when the Rodney King verdict was announced, and remember how to learn from history and how to learn from what I learned from that whole experience, because that experience helped launch me into feeling like I had to become an activist, feeling like it really affected me. That anger I felt made me feel like I have to become a real member of my democracy, and that I actually have the power to do things. And I've never chosen to run for office, not even student body president, but I have chosen to create, cultural objects like books and films, and I did not know what I was doing before I did it. And I think the lesson there, and I was, watching and noticing all the things that hopefully you didn't notice, where I'm like, that's where I was using my iPhone for a microphone. That's where, because there were lots of on-the-fly moments making this. But the thing that's cool about that, even though it's not a perfect, super high production value, multi-million-dollar entity, is that I was just able to see a truth and see something I cared about, and I was able to make something out of it so that all of us could sit here and have a communal experience where we could discuss it. So I think, taking stock of what makes you tick and what your real story is, and being a really good listener so you can hear what's going on around you, provides the beginnings of the pathway to figuring out what you as an individual are going to be able to do to make the world resemble something, something you can live in. We're in a really interesting moment right now, because Title IX is a valuable legal tool. It just is. That said, it's after the fact, so it's not about making a situation not happen. It's about having maybe some semblance of justice in the aftermath, and creating a campus culture where there's a clear line of adjudication, at least, once there's an assault, because every campus has an assault problem. That said, I think there's tremendous confusion. I think there's confusion among administrators, certainly among students, and among anybody who's a mandated reporter about what this is going to really mean for them. And I think a lot of this will shake out in the next few years as people become educated. But the reality is, if you're mandated reporters, yes, they do have to report, but they don't have to undermine the anonymity of the person that's talking to them. So it's not, it doesn't mean, it's so that you can have good, authentic statistics on your campus. That's a meaningful thing. But it is not supposed to undermine or be, not be victim-led. Okay, so I feel like even as I'm explaining it, and it sounds, and I'm tripping over it, you can tell already like how complex this is. And all the campuses that I've been to since that, oh, thank you. Oh, that's really nice to hear. I mean, I think since that, so this is the Title IX coordinator right here. I think since that Dear Colleague letter, people have been really struggling to have meaningful compliance. And I definitely think that schools that have Title IX coordinators, everyone has to, but that have really dedicated people, you have someone who is staying on the cutting edge at all times of what the students' rights are. And maybe not thinking it, and I don't think they're thinking of it so much, I mean, they're not against the administration, but the administration and the administration's PR is probably not their first point of view. And I think that's a good ally, that's a good tension to have in a college if you're going to meaningfully deal with rape. Wagatwe's story, just FYI, her Title IX complaint didn't go anywhere. And so she's interesting too. She's become a really big activist. Like if you Google her now, Wagatwe Wanjuki, she's a big deal, since this happened. But in terms of seeing justice, she's seeing justice as an activist and her stories having impact. She did not see justice really for her particular case, although some changes were made, as we allude in the film, to Tufts. But Tufts has been, anyway, Tufts is a whole other story. Tufts is really recalcitrant right now. Okay, well, I think the thing I'm most focused on lately is this concept of slut or thought. You know, like any of these really, it just means sexy and kind of fun. These really demeaning terms that historically, I mean, we try to reclaim them or whatever, but historically they've been used to denigrate women and girl sexuality and then justify or cover up rape and harassment. I think eradicating that word, like having that absence of that word would be meaningful. And the absence of the word, the consciousness that would come with that. So like if we all conscientiously were like, I don't call myself a slut, I don't call my friends a slut, because that word is such a slur and it is connected to such historical atrocities that it's not funny. That to me would, that's like a small thing that I think has large reverberations because we very casually, I think, utilize that. And you even saw the women there, like my sister, for instance, you know, because she was called a slut, like, again, overnight, this was like a dorky violin playing nerd with braces who was very shy, who was assaulted, and then she became, you know, you would have thought she was like porn star, like overnight. And so the reality of her situation, like no one even connected to reality. And she wasn't allowed to connect to reality. And it was because there's this magic thing, slut, which means that there are people in our community that are scapegoats, and you're allowed to do anything to them. You can take pictures when they're passed out and with people peeing on them, and it's okay, because they're not really human. And so to me, that's a big chunk of rape culture that's so in our face, and so all over high school and junior high and college, that if we address that in meaningful ways, I think it would have some dimension. I mean, I guess the only story that I actively solicited, the sad truth that was like a bounty, I guess, for me is it's very easy. I could have made the film just from the people in this audience, too. I mean, it's very easy to find people who've been treated in a way that they didn't deserve sexually, and who are, who've had to have a lot of silent pain around that, so, and lack of acknowledgement. But Lisa Brenner, the Native American woman, I went after her because Native American women are so overrepresented when it comes to sexual assault. But other than that, it was just literally like it really was like people who kind of came across my field of vision when I needed to do another shoot. It took quite a while to make it because I did a bunch of other things. I wrote another book, and I had a baby, and I got married, I moved, I did 50 other things while I was making it. And so it took a while, and so there's a little bit of serendipity with the stories. And I appreciate that you feel like there was range. And it's not like there was no conscientiousness about that, but I guess I'm saying it was easier to do than you might imagine. And the woman Annie, who's that middle story with her father, what was interesting about how long it took me to finish it is that whole second part happened while I was pregnant or whatever, you know, and then so when I circled back to her just to be like, oh, and now I'm picking this back up and editing, she had had this whole other experience. And you see how much she changed in 2 years. Like, she's in some ways a totally different person in the way she talks about the story. And now, I mean, I've seen her recently, she's yet another person. And I think, you know, if I'd been able to do that with all of the women in the film, I think you would have seen, like, there's this moment of telling your truth that's very kind of terrifying, but it changes you. And, you know, they kind of all went off onto these different sort of like ways of managing this thing that had happened to them. But there was this profound feeling of exposure right when they told the story. They all wanted to. It wasn't like I, you know, nagged anyone into this. But, you know, for each of them, they then watched the film in their communities, you know, and it was really a big deal because maybe no one in their family knew, or, you know, all these sorts of things. And, but since then, I mean, I've been able to really see the power that came from, at first they felt really exposed, and then in each case, so many people came up to them afterwards and realized that they were a safe person to talk to, or somebody that could relate, and they were able to become, I think, the healers that they were maybe always meant to be. And so that was kind of a neat thing that came out of it that I didn't know would happen. I was very nervous when it started screening too, that maybe it was in some ways exploitative because these stories were so vulnerable. Oh my God, the process of making, like editing it, I mean, when I'd sit there and interview people, yeah, I'd be nodding and like really empathizing and crying, you know, but trying not to make noise. And then editing, just because editing takes forever, so you're just sort of staring at the same clip and then it has to render, and you're like, no. I cried so much, and I really, for all of them, I cried for their bravery and for the stories they were telling and just the beauty of their stories and the hopes that they had for their children and the sadnesses that they had about, you know, their family of origin. Like, all of it was so intense to me, but particularly probably my sister, because, you know, I was 12 when all that happened, and I think there's a part of me that doesn't, even though it's totally irrational, I don't forgive myself for not understanding more what had happened and being able to be there for her. And so it's been really, I cry a lot from this movie. Well, okay, so it's screened, it came out a couple years ago. It's screened at hundreds of schools already in settings just like this, and when I'm fortunate enough to be there, I get to have these kind of conversations. Women Make Movies distributes it, and so it goes out at, you know, whatever. Given things that are going on right now, I guess there would be a possibility that it could have like a TV broadcast that happened with the abortion film, but I don't know. So I think what my desire is that it just keeps continuing to be shown in places like this, in different communities, and allow people to have conversations that I think are really necessary and often suppressed. Well, that's a complicated question. So the question is, how have men's feelings about rape? I think there's certainly more consciousness about, you know, there was a time when there wasn't even a word, date rape. You know, like, so the vast majority of sexual assaults happen between people who know each other quite well, or even on a date. But it wasn't until, you know, the 80s that word gained popularity, you know, where it was like something people knew. So merely having a way to label your experience, it's a pretty profound, you know, shift for everybody. So I would say that was a shift. That said, I think that there's still so little real understanding of, I mean, perpetrator isn't even the word I really like to use, but perpetuator, you know, of the person who commits the wrong, and trying to provide a space, a meaningful space for that person to face if it's a man, what he has done, so that he can grow. I don't think we have meaningful, in a mass way, meaningful ways to do that. And that's something I would be really interested in, the college that could create that sort of thing. Okay, lots of hands popped up with that one. I feel like I have to call on this woman in the way back row first because she's had her hand up for a while. Yes, I've had men come up to me many times and wonder if when they watch this, and wonder if maybe something that they always felt a little off about, and they seem anguished, honestly. So I think that's part of a perpetuator. I mean, that's not every, I mean, they're serial rapists, you know, there are serial rapists, there's lots of them. But I think that that's an element that I'm interested in that I don't think we know that much about. Most of the research that's done on perpetuators or perpetrators is by this incredible researcher named David Lesak. He's out of Boston, but he works with men who are in prison as serial rapists. And I think that that's really valuable research that he's doing, but I think it's too narrow, honestly, to really fully understand what's going on the campus. And I could be wrong. It could be like once we have a full sample that's like everything he came up with is true, but I don't think we know that yet. I've also had a lot of men say to me that their confusion about, this is where like sort of alcohol and the way that we just interact with one another when we're like trying to try on our sexuality or have sex comes into play, that they feel genuine confusion about the dynamics, which doesn't exonerate someone from if they've violated somebody. But I think that there is some genuine confusion about what a person is doing and when and why, and when both parties are very drunk, I think it is a complex situation, and one that, again, I'm not sure we fully address in a meaningful way with people. Like we haven't addressed in a meaningful way the reality of adolescent sexual experimentation, and sometimes I think there's just some really sort of like, hey, you know, really simplistic things like don't drink if you don't want to get raped kind of stuff that gets kind of put out there. As opposed to really analyzing like, okay, well, why do we need alcohol so much? And then as the asker, me, myself being like, yeah, and why do I in sexuality? Like, what is about that exposure or that vulnerability that is helped by intoxicants? And so I think like getting real about our own practices might be helpful in this too.